any event, guardrail was installed on sections of these roads. There were 3 highways that converge in Willow Creek, which is the county seat of Humboldt County. I think it's the county seat. So there were sections that had guardrail, and there were sections of the road that did not. And David had accumulated about 7 years worth of data up to the point that the guardrails were installed. And for the next 10 years, he continued to accumulate data as they rappelled down the sides of the mountain and so on. And he called me and said, I need some help with the study of this. I have the data now. Okay, so I went out and we sat down and looked at what he had, and it was excellent. He had really done a very good job. He'd gone to the medical examiner's office for the fatals. He had gone to the hospitals to get the non-fatal injuries, and he had done a really thorough job in collecting the data. And we devised a study to compare the sections where the guardrail had been put in place with the sections where it had not been put in place. Because, as I said earlier, you have some trends in motor vehicle crashes and fatalities that are a result of other factors. But in this case, it was very similar to the other kinds of studies. In the 7 years before, at the installation sites, there were about 2 deaths per year. This is deaths per year. So about 14 deaths occurred at the installation sites before. And at the other sites, it was almost 2 as well, about 2 per year. In the 10 years afterward, there were none. Not a single death where they had installed guardrail. And still almost as many as at the other sites. So we also had to take into account changes in traffic flow. We got data on traffic counts on those roads from the California Trans. And after a fairly complicated statistical analysis, we said, this is really real. About 20 fewer deaths in that 10-year period than would have been expected from the traffic flow and the number of deaths that were still occurring at places where they did not install guardrails. This is another study that was undertaken in the White River area by the environmental health officer. She did this as her project for the year's fellowship. She was interested in falls occurring on White River, and the records were good enough that she could tell that they were occurring on stairs and that they were concentrated in certain communities. So she went out and collected data on the stairs. And she compared stairs in communities that weren't having falls with stairs in community that were having the falls. And she measured various attributes of the stairs, how far apart the steps were, whether they were uniform. You can see that one's short, and that one's long. Whether or not they had handrails, how wide they were, and so on. And she found wonderful things from an epidemiologist's point of view, not from the injured's point of view. Here's an 81-year-old person missed the last step of this and fell and had a mid-shaft femur fracture. This is someone who had a left knee injury going down these steps. Again, uneven, both in terms of the step going this way and across this way. This was another HIP home. This one has been broken off. In any event, she found substantial differences in the characteristics of the stairs, how many handrails, whether or not they had handrails, whether they were level, how high they were, how wide they were, and so on. And as a result of her study, the community organization organized people to go out and repair the stairs in the community. They have a big lumber company up there. The lumber company contributed the lumber, and of course the people contributed their time, and they went out and repaired stairs substantially throughout the community, and this has been taken up in other communities as well, in other reservation areas. To my knowledge, no one has done a follow-up study to see how much difference it has made, but it's quite evident just looking at these pictures that repairs were needed. I was in Sitka, Alaska, and I happened to notice some houses that had a similar kind of problem. These are the narrowest stairs I think I've ever seen coming out of a house. No handrail. I don't have a study of how many people were being injured there, but I was up there for a training session, but I was just astonished that, and here's another one in Sitka, this old dilapidated type stairs. Uneven, both across this way and as well as the distance between the steps. One final example, in Alaska, it is not motor vehicles that's the leading cause of death from injury as it is in the lower 48. It's drowning. Most people, a lot of people in Alaska travel by boat or raft or whatever rather than by car because there aren't that many roads out in the bush, as they call it. The kids in Sitka call it bush light. This young man is Ronald Perkins. He's became head of the injury control program for the Indian Health Service for Alaska, and after he retired, it now heads a private firm that still does this, a nonprofit that still does this sort of work. In any event, the people there were very concerned about drowning and what they could possibly do about drowning. And there are two problems in Alaska with going in the water. One is drowning and the other is freezing to death. Found this firm that made these kinds of jackets. Now, these jackets look very ordinary, but they are float coats, as they call them. They have flotation built into the coat. So if you fall in, you're not going under. And it gives whoever's around a chance to pull you out. These were sold at various stores throughout Alaska at cost. A lot of the merchants agreed with the people in the environmental health people to sell them at cost. And Ron has done a study that I have lost my copy of, so I can't tell you the exact numbers, but he did find reductions in drowning rates, at least partly attributable to the float coat program. Another thing they did in Alaska, a lot of the deaths were occurring to fishermen out at sea. The boats would go out, and they had specific times that they were allowed to go out, and they had to go out during those times. Well, if it was stormy, freezing cold, whatever, they still went out. And the rigging on the fishing boats would literally cake up with so much ice that they would flip over, upside down, and people would drown. So they changed the law to a quota system. You could catch so many fish, and they had monitored how many they could catch, but they released them from having to go out during specific hours. And the death rates tumbled again, because the fishermen went out when the weather was decent rather than going out when they had to during these specified hours. Just a simple little change in the rules can make a lot of difference in some cases. Well, I hope I've convinced you that, one, this works, and two, as Harold said at the outset, we ought to have it for the rest of us, not just in the Indian Health Service. Now, but this raises the question of who's going to do it. And probably even the bigger question, who's going to pay for it? Most health departments operate under grant-type budgets. They'll have a base budget for salaries and that sort of thing, but whatever the federal government or the state government is emphasizing, then they apply for grants to work on that particular problem. And as I said at the outset, injuries has not been a high priority in a lot of these agencies. So it's going to take a while for us to train enough people to be available, even if we could pay for it. But I think it's something that is needed in every community of any size. And I'm looking forward to the day when we can reduce a lot of injuries as we did the earlier infectious diseases by this kind of effort.